Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sarah Conway. I'm a reporter at City Bureau. My reporting partner, Trina Reynolds-Tyler, is the data director and investigative reporter at Invisible Institute. We're so happy to be here. FOIA Fest was really the place where I learned how to do FOIA. 9 years ago, had never done a FOIA request in my life. I wasn't really even sure what they were, and being in a space like this is one to learn. And so we're really happy to be here to share our project with you. Missing in Chicago is transforming how missing persons cases, particularly those involving Black women and girls, are investigated, reported, and understood at the local and national level. Trina Reynolds-Tyler and I wanted our investigative work to shape public policy and conversations about accountability in law enforcement. And today we're going to take you on our journey of blending data analysis of over 1 million police records with community-centered reporting to create an investigation that exposed systemic neglect and racial disparities in CPD's response to missing persons cases. For the young reporters in the room, you can do this work too. We are just two reporters who have a really deep relationship and friendship with one another, and we really learned on the go doing this investigation. So I hope if you take anything from it, to know that this work is for you too, and do it with your friends. Build community while you're doing your investigative reporting.
Hello everyone. We feel it's important to just first ground us in the story of the people who police that's moving into these records. The early 2000s, which got in mind with really sometimes the officers known as FOIA group. They have a history of federal lawsuits taking place. Through her lawsuit against the city of Chicago, founder of the Invisible Institute, how they intervened and really the lawsuit effectively asking that police misconduct record be public information in the state of Illinois. And so, after a long time, we got those records as far as 1967, but the information was kind of, it was like structured data. We didn't have documents that had narratives. With that information in 2015, we created CPDT. It's a public database that the Invisible Institute continues to host. Where people can see police misconduct records, obviously in neighborhoods, and geographic information. You can see that database on CPDT.co. But they also, right, in 2015, amending cross-claims and FOIA requests to the Chicago police, where they all closed complaint register files related to Chicago police officers. When CPD did respond, he sued in the circuit court and alleged CPD violated FOIA, findings of the use of the records, those documents, and due to this FOIA request, we since received all underlying documents connected to cases between 2011 and 2015. I can't see the screen anymore, but I'm gonna keep rolling with it. Cool. So when we received those documents, we began processing them in collaboration with HRBAC, Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and the Lucy Parsons Lab. And together we scraped underlying documents for narrative text, specifically looking for documents that would give us more insight into the complaint. We had hundreds of thousands of documents associated with over 27,000 complaints. I created Beneath the Surface, a project done in collaboration with HRDAG to parse through the narrative text. We built a simple algorithm which was designed to read through narratives and help us more easily categorize the complaints. Here we go. And then this inter-radar reliability. So we needed, when we were doing this part of the project, it was like, we needed inter-radar reliability, which meant that everyone who was reading the narrative would agree on what the narrative would be labeled as. And then we also took a look at, how many people disagreed that this narrative was associated with neglect or sexual violations. For over 7 months, a group of women met every week to read these documents together and label them. There was one group of women under the age of 35 and then another group of women women over the age of 40 who were just meeting regularly, reading complaints, and labeling them. And in that instance, you know, they kept asking us, like, are you sure we're not reading the same complaints over and over again? I feel like I read this last week. But what was really happening is that in these underlying narratives, there are a lot of people telling the same stories, connecting them across space and time, even though that they had never met before. Eventually, we put out an ask for more volunteers. We had like an influx of 200 volunteers. It was a wild time, but ultimately led to some really interesting findings. We can go to the next slide. The first set of complaints we looked at were the categories of neglect. We produced libraries of misconduct that you can read on btsurface.com that were like complaints related to police response to sexual assault, police response to gender-based violence. But really the purpose of the project was to identify potential investigations. And there was a group of complaints related to the way the Chicago police handle missing person cases. And it was 54 groups. The slide that you're looking at right now is actually a screenshot from an allegation of a DCFS staff member who was claiming that Chicago police was prematurely closing the case of a child in care, even though the child was still missing.
So our collaboration has been symbiotic. As reporters, we were able to lean on each other's strengths to do the reporting. Trina analyzed structured data received through FOIA requests and identified critical requests. I maintained an organized system for tracking FOIAs, filing them, and then combing through media reports to get leads on cases. We used data sets to identify cases that we wanted to pull underlying documents from. Across multiple agencies. Together, we collectively looked at Chicago missing persons data with CPD, homicide data, reported crime data, Cook County medical examiner data, OMC calls, Cook County sheriff data, and we interviewed more than 40 sources, and we produced short videos to document the project. The first thing that we really did that's connected to Judy, the algorithm, is that we pulled these 54 complaints made against officers that were all associated with missing persons cases. And we decided to build our own database. You could do this in Google Sheets. We used Airtable, but basically we went through and we coded the actual records to see could we find any trends in them. And one of the things we saw was that there were 17 complaints for officers for allegedly refusing to file a missing persons report. And none of the officers named in these complaints were disciplined. This is really relevant because when we started talking to families, the same trends showed up. When we were doing, qualitative interviews with impacted people who care about the issue of missing persons in Chicago. We also saw through coding the 54 complaints that Black women made up a majority of the complaints against officers, and it was often when they were trying to report their children missing. Additionally, we found that officers at stations, when families had tried to file an in-person report, they were told instead to call 911, even though Illinois clearly states that police cannot refuse in-person reports. So these are all things that helped us kind of like early on identify trends. And we wanted then to test in the reporting, like, is this true on a larger scale? We quickly saw when we started looking at missing persons data that this is an issue that really deeply impacts Black Chicagoans. Black people in Chicago make up nearly 2/3 of all missing persons cases over the past 20 years. And then within that data, we also saw that Black girls and women between the ages of 10 and 20 make up 30% of all missing persons cases, despite only compromising 2% of the city's population. So this helped us start to understand that there was an over-representation of Black girls and women in the data, and that there's something going on public health-wise. When we attempted to measure the way that the Chicago police responded to these cases, we quickly learned that they were missing critical data points to evaluate themselves. In 2017, CPD Deputy Chief James Jones said, "The Chicago Police Department takes each missing persons report seriously and investigates each one consistently across race and gender." And that was said in a public meeting. Later it was said, "We also want to dispel the idea that missing persons affect efforts disfavor African Americans. However, the missing data indicated that the Chicago Police Department could not reasonably evaluate themselves in making a claim like that, that reports were investigated consistently across race and gender. It begs the question of how much can you trust statistics shared by public officials in meetings and press conferences? And this is really important to share because you should always interrogate the data. You should really be trying to pull things to fact check what public officials are telling you. When we took a look at the Cook County Medical Examiner's data, which is the agency that serves as the coroner for Chicago and surrounding cities, the data for female homicides was overrepresentative. Black females were much more likely than any race to die by homicide. Given what people were saying anecdotally, we knew there was a chance that people within the missing persons data would also appear in Cook County Medical Examiner's data, meaning that Black women who were reported as missing to the Chicago police in data might also be reported by another government agency as deceased. We, started gathering a lot of data and records, and one thing that really helped us is that we were structured in our own filing system. You can really easily on Google Forms or Airtable, if you have one, build your own form where you can input your records requests. This allowed us just to be very organized. We were able to, know exactly when we needed to follow up. You can even automate you can automate reminders on Airtable about deadlines when a FOIA officer should get back to you. Another really important reason why this project was successful is because we spent a lot of time getting to know FOIA officers. They can really help you. It can feel at times that you're at odds with them, but because they handle a lot of records, and if you start building a relationship with them, you can kind of become fluent in the record language of an agency. What's normal for them to give you, what is not. When FOIA officers deny you and you think unfairly, you can always reference past requests that you've had to kind of demonstrate that actually they should give you the records. And when things don't work out, call FOIA officers on the phone. They, can really help you, and if that doesn't work, take your concern up the chain. And one of the biggest things that we've kind of learned is that FOIA officers can be a really great key to actually getting talked to the data management teams at different agencies. And that can be really critical when you are trying to get records, but you're not sure entirely how the data is kept. They can really help you out there.
Speaking of the importance of these relationships with FOIA officers, when you're looking at data, it's extremely important to verify your records, to pull those documents where you can. We use data sets in collaboration with media reports to identify people who were missing and later found deceased, and then correspond that with the Chicago missing persons, reported missing persons data. And in Cook County, it's really expensive to get autopsy reports. They cost hundreds of dollars. It's depending on if you just want the records or if you want photos as well. So by way of Sarah's special relationship building with FOIA officers, we were offered to go into their offices and sit for hours reading autopsy reports into a voice recorder that we later uploaded to Otter AI, which is an AI tool for transcription that many folks use. Through this process, we were able to better gain an understanding of the manner of death. If it was very obvious that they had been murdered when they first passed away, was when they were first discovered, and confirm the RD number connected to their case. So on this slide, you can see it's a screenshot of a Chicago Tribune article that talks about the murder of an aspiring journalist named Lisa Jean Tinnen. And she's a poet. She published many things on the interweb. In this process, we actually found her blog where she wrote poetry, and it was really powerful. But the detectives in this Chicago Tribune article went on record and said, well, it's too early to say that she was murdered, even though the medical examiner's office had ruled her death homicide. And even in the face of the family, who were basically saying who were attempting to grieve their child, but were also dealing with law enforcement, who were attempting to blame her death on a suicide, even though the evidence offered the contrary. Within our data, her case was labeled as closed, non-criminal, and just like want to call to attention just like the power of us going in there and like reading those records, because like even though you can't actually see, even though you don't get to have the access to those records like in your hands, we basically were kind of able to, just by way of reading it and transcribing it, had like basically kind of like a copy of the autopsy. There's other tech to transcribe audio. People use Trent, Script, Rev, Avoma, Fathom, Airgram. I think take a look at the privacy laws associated with them and the ease of the use of it, but it can be extremely useful to use.
We also wanted to make a lot of effort to talk to former and current law enforcement. So we spent a lot of time trying to find police officers and detectives, current and former in Chicago, to talk to about the process, to really hear their perspective. We also talked to a lot of police officers around the country. We wanted to understand the infrastructure of how police handle these cases. What does it look like? What are the stresses of their jobs? What is it, how does a missing persons case move through police data systems? What forms do they use? We saw that, when people disappear, often community members don't rely entirely on police. Oftentimes families go out, they do searches themselves, people on a block go out and do searches. And one of our local law enforcement sources, Gerald Hamilton, who's a retired homicide detective, he actually volunteers his time to go out and lead searches for missing Black women and girls on the South and the West Side. And he had kind of pointed to that community really needs to be brought into this by police, that they can play a really critical role in trying to improve law enforcement processes, but also just in the search for loved ones. We also, through our police sources, learned that law enforcement, some of them really wanted the missing persons report to be digitized. It was, while we were doing this project, it was one of the last remaining paper-based forms that CPD used. And again, like when we started talking to other police departments around the country, we learned that that was pretty abnormal. One police source at a department, he said that he was like, wow, CPD is a dinosaur. They still use a paper-based form for missing persons. And Patricia Casey, who was a retired police commander, she actually led youth investigations. So like when kids who are in group homes or DCFS go missing, or young people, she was really tasked with overseeing that entire aspect of CPD's work. And she really wanted there to be a screening form, to just like CPD be collecting more data on what happens when young people go missing. And that's always a fraught thing, like will people be honest with the police when they're missing? But we started through these sourcing, really starting to understand how law enforcement felt about the issue.
Yeah, so we looked at Chicago Police Department versus the National Police. I think Sarah actually alluded to, this is Sarah's slide that she just spoke about, where we talked to the National Police and where they called them a dinosaur. On the next slide, you'll see that there is, so like some of these agencies, like they already have portals. Even in the previous slide when we were talking to folks, they were like, well, we have a missing persons portal so that people can easily gain access to that stuff. And Cook County Sheriff's Office Missing Person Project, they have one as well. And so we were able to like pull specific Chicago-related cases from their portal while we were waiting for more underlying documents, more related to the cases that we were interested in. Go to the next slide. Through looking at this Cook County Sheriff's Missing Persons Project, we were able to identify this case of Lindsay Franklin. She was a 61-year-old who was reported missing in 2011. She actually passed away and was a Jane Doe in the Cook County Medical Examiners on the 13th of July of 2013. She had a heart attack on the bus stop. But then a year later, there was, Chicago police wrote a report that said she returned and she was safe. And it was, it was like, how are these, it was impossible that she was safe if, she was a Jane Doe in the morgue at the time. But at this point, we were trying to pinpoint, okay, who knew what when, right? Go to the next slide. So here's a document that we received from the Cook County Sheriff's, from their Missing Persons Project. They knew that Chicago police had prematurely closed the missing person case. And that just kind of goes to show that some of these agencies who are working parallel with one another, they're aware of some of the funky circumstances that are happening, and if you develop relationships, there might be even a chance that someone could provide information to you that could encourage you to FOIA it. But this screenshot from this document shows that Commander Jason Moran, he knew, right, that when he was even investigating this case, that Chicago police had closed the case saying that she was alive, even though they were talking to her daughter, and her daughter was saying, no, I have not found my daughter yet. Luckily, I think it was the end of 2022, they announced that they identified Lindsay Franklin. She was buried in the Catholic cemetery, and her daughter had some peace. There was clearly, a lack of, these are some of the ways you can use different governmental agencies' information to cross-examine one another to see where accountability is slipping. Next slide.
We were able to identify 11 additional homicide cases that were connected to missing persons cases. They were all labeled as close non-criminal, which means that they were likely found and the case was not associated with any crime. And 2 of these cases included Black teenage girls who the Chicago Police Department had closed their cases actually before they were found. The first case we're going to talk about is Shavonna Prather. She was 17 years old. She worked at a McDonald's on the south side. She was pregnant, and CPD data showed that police closed her case on April 26th at 3 in the afternoon. They wrote in a document that she was found with a friend and she was safe. However, the medical examiner data, the report shows that her body was found at 5 p.m. that day. And she had actually been murdered. She had been there about a week where her body was disposed of. And when we read the autopsy report, we learned that they had closed her date. When they closed her case, she had been dead for nearly a week. So it's not possible that Chicago police had spoken with her mother or that she was at a friend's house, but instead she had actually been killed by her manager when she asked for money for an abortion. The data on the screen and the image is one of a false report made by police that shows that, in fact, she had been murdered. And if you only rely on data or police records, you can miss things like this. So if you take anything from this presentation, that you should be very rigorous in examining government records and see where they exist in adjacent agencies, because you'll find discrepancies. We also wanted to share with you the case of 16-year-old Desiree Robinson. Law enforcement claimed that she had been found, but actually at that same time period, she was being sex trafficked on Backpage.com. 4 days later, after they said that she had been found, on Christmas Eve, an adult male violently murdered her after she refused to perform a sex act for free in a garage in Markham, Illinois, while her sex trafficker slept outside. In the case of Desiree Robinson, law enforcement claimed that she was found, but she was actually being trafficked. And she had told a friend on Facebook that she was in a really dangerous situation and she didn't know what to do. She went to a party and a man would just not actually let her leave. And that's really, what sex trafficking can look like in Chicago. It can be really rooted in domestic violence and deeply impacts teenage girls. And when Chicago police closed her case, they lied in their own records. She was actually being trafficked. She was not home safe with a friend. And so we want to share that as journalists, and I'll pass the mic to Trina, our role is really to mine public information through records.
Yeah. I mean, we have been really hammering the nail in here is that there are a couple things that are happening here. It's you need to, when it's so important to have data because it's gonna help you to see what a big picture is, but ultimately it's not the full picture. You need to have documents that you are able to verify with it so that you can actually be firm in your questions when you are pressing upon elected officials. And you also need to it's important to rather develop your data lens in the sense of okay, this is what they say it looks like, but then what does it actually look like? And what information are they actually collecting versus what information should they be collecting in order to make the claims that they are making publicly? Next slide.
You'll really want to marry the data with lived experience. Data and records don't exist without people. You can learn a lot from data, you can learn a lot from underlying records, but it's not enough to really understand how these things impact even a single human life. And so really think of your reporting as a painting. The data and the records are the outline, and the people, the sources who are impacted by stuff, they're the pain and the beauty. One of my friends in Chicago, who I really deeply respect, Sebastian Aldago, he always talks about you have to really love the people who are at the heart of your stories. And so you'll see with this story that Trina and I really deeply love these families. We really deeply love the people who are impacted by this issue, and that shows up in how you cover it. So it's really imperative that you find the care to share with yourself and people who are in your stories who are impacted by an issue. Be very curious about their experience, hold their stories and believe them, but really verify what they say for them and you. A lot of times in reporting, people have a lot of trauma, and sometimes they really don't remember things correctly. And so, to give power to their voice, you really need to verify everything and rely on data and records to do that as best as you can. We're going to talk about the case of Sonia Rouse. Sonia is still missing. She went missing in March 2016. And we connected with her mother and her younger sister. Sonia was actually another person who wanted to be a journalist. She really wanted to be in broadcast media. She was a total bookworm, very beloved by her family. She had a daughter and developed postpartum depression, and she really never recovered from it. And that was something we wanted to show in our story, was really the connection between disabilities and public health crises and a lot of violence in the city. Sonia ended up in a pretty bad domestic violence relationship, and the person that she was last seen with was her partner. The detective that was assigned to her case, we found through public records, actually he had documented incidents of domestic violence against his own family, against his wife and daughter, so much so that he had actually broken his daughter's eardrum. And the family really questioned, did this person actually give his all when he was investigating the case of Sonia, which she's never been found. Is one of the things that we learned from her mother. She chooses to believe that Sonia is still alive, while her younger sister does not.
So this slide is just a screenshot from the police misconduct record. So again, in our project, we used multiple, it was even though we were looking at Sonia Rouse's story, and we're talking about how this detective handled her case and how, that she was missing it, we were able to look at police misconduct records as well, just really honing down on this kind of intersectional piece of attempting to pull as many sets of information that you can in order to fully understand what's happening here.
We also wanted to share the case of Shante Bohannon. Shante Bohannon was also in a relationship with a young man. He was shot in front of her. She witnessed that. And, it turned into an issue on social media that people thought she was associated with his death. Her family was very afraid for her safety. One day she left the house to go visit her boyfriend's family, and called later to say in police records that a gun was being held to her head and she wasn't being allowed to leave. Her mother, Tammy Pittman, went immediately to a police station and asked officers to search the house, and they had told her that her daughter had actually run away. She actually had to go back with her ex-husband in order for them to even take the report, which kind of points to this thing. If you look at police data and records, you might not exactly see that. That's not going to show up in police data that they refuse to take a missing persons report, but it will show up when you start talking to impacted families. Tammy Pitton, police went and searched the home and they found nothing, and 2 days later, her daughter's body was found in a garage in Burnside on the south side. And her death is still ruled undetermined, which has actually been a huge pain point for the family who want answers in what happened to her. We also wanted to point out in your reporting, really seek out leaders on the issues that you're reporting on. Daisy Hayes was a 65-year-old. She went missing from Chicago Housing Authority senior apartments. And her daughter, Teresa Smith, really truly went to war for her mother. She connected with Coco. She kept pressing police, because she did not believe that her mother just disappeared. She went into her apartment and then was never seen again. And we quickly, through researching kind of what's going on with the state task force, who are people who have publicly spoken about this, who are people that are associated with a community group like Coco, who's really leading on this issue locally, we were able to connect with Daisy. And when you connect with people who they may not have the mic at, a state task force meeting, or they might not, be at the City Council Public Safety Committee, but there are real leaders in community who have lived experience and have a lot of perspective on solutions and how things can be improved. And Daisy Hayes' daughter, Teresa Smith, is one of those people.
In the story, and I'm going to move a little quickly because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. Just remember, keeping community engagement is key. These kinds of engagements, just tabling. We went to Coco's annual walk for her. We engaged with them. We're publishing kind of in an ongoing way. Before we made the big publishing, before we produced the whole series, because in these conversations with people, we were learning information, right? They were able to give us insight into things to look into, things, types of incidents. I just really think that if you're going to be really good at FOIAing information, having access to a person who can tell you, oh, this thing happened on this date at this time is really important. And then also, in the process of our reporting, we had just kind of a roundtable discussion with 5 impacted families, and could see just even the way that they were engaging with one another helped us to have more insight into this kind of issue. We are not, we are connected to missing person cases in Chicago, but we are a bit more far removed, and so being able to, in our reporting, witness the way that other people were talking about the issue and all of the things that they connected was really critical in us having a really crisp and nuanced perspective.
We also made a lot of effort to be not just publish. We convened people doing reading groups. We wanted to have discussions with people who had read the story and were curious about it. We had a big multimedia exhibit at the Chicago Art Department, who was really generous to have us in that space, where we had police records on display. We also had a vigil for families where people could leave flowers for some of the impacted families in our story and people that they knew had been missing in Chicago. We also, when we published, we published on a website, but we sought out local publishing partners, which I feel is just such bread and butter of the local journalism ecosystem in Chicago. We published with Southside Weekly and the Tribe and the Chicago Reader, and we were able to tap into a national partnership called Word in Black, which is a collective of historic Black publishers around the country who also syndicated the series. We knew that a really long investigation is not for everyone, particularly for young people who, we referenced Coco. We were showing up over 4 years at the We Walk for Her March, which is a youth-led march from CPD headquarters down to Washington Park, and we made sure that we made a Know Your Rights guide with some of the really core things that we wanted people to know about what are their actual rights when they report a loved one missing. We were really proud of the impact of the story. Impact is a strange thing because we all do really great work, and sometimes you know, it can be just something that does happen and sometimes doesn't happen, and that's okay, but I think it's all part of a larger arc of justice that we're working towards as journalists, particularly in Chicago. A lot of this impact actually on the screen we didn't know until we went to the Public Safety Committee, because CPD had been really cagey with us and actually kind of telling us anything from changes that they made, but the story led to them digitizing the missing persons report, which is something that Trina and I had like really prayed for. Not so much to be like, we changed that, but to be like, wow, you can actually save lives if you're not waiting 2 weeks to type a paper form into a digital system, which is so sad. You know, they also improved policies and best practices for their missing persons investigations and data management. They instituted a mandatory digital screening to identify whether returned missing persons had experienced harm or needed more support. They hired an investigative data analyst, victim advocates, and a liaison at the medical examiner's office. And they're starting to use their own resource guide for families when they go missing. And now they're regularly attending the Illinois Task Force on Missing and Murdered Women. We also saw that, you know, we were really proud that one of our sources, Mandy Stark, who one of her really good friends went missing, and that's how she got into advocacy for missing people in Chicago. She ended up actually joining the state task force because of her reporting. She hadn't known that it existed.
And then lastly, you know, speaking of the state task force, you know, when they did their 2024 report that they submitted to the governor, they provided 8 recommendations, and missing in Chicago was referenced in every single one of them. And so it's really, you know, this opportunity to engage at a city and state level has been really critical, and I think it's especially connected to the way that we engage with these governmental agencies through FOIA, right, at both levels. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have 5 minutes, we'll make this really quick. We're gonna hit all the points as fast as we can. But so you mentioned you sold, like, I'm sort of blown away by Judy, the algorithm. How did that happen? Like, how did you develop that?
I'm gonna pass to Trina, because Judy is her baby. Trina. Judy, the algorithm, how did it happen?
Yeah, you're muted.
So much. Okay, you said, how was it built? How did it
Yes. How did you make it happen?
Okay, really, it was made, there was like years long of thinking, because when we had CPDP, it was like, we could only see this primary category piece. We really needed to see the underlying narratives. I specifically was like, wait, sexual violations are happening underneath these documents. Honestly, for the creation of it, it happened purely through collaboration and through persistence, right? Like, the documents break, the primary lab, HR DAG, like the code written, me, HR DAG, some other like volunteers who joined us, who were like, I want to work on this project. And then also like community members who were just committed to meeting every week and reading these horrible narratives. And often like it was repetitive, it was kind of boring, and building relationships with each other. That is how it was made.
So speaking of building relationships, I think, again, you talked about how difficult it was to get information from the police department, right? So you had to do like a gazillion workarounds. Can you talk about that a little more, about like having to sort of circumvent, you know, this agency that's supposed to be, you know, transparent, but isn't?
I would say quick TLDR is that I was sending in FOIA requests pretty much daily. I've sent in so many FOIA requests that I know most of the FOIA officers at CPD, and I can be really honest, like they can be really, really helpful. And we studied data and records so much that when we started talking to police officers, we actually understood like about all of their policy and procedures. We understood what like their cases look like. We understood what they look like in the data. So that allowed, I think, a level of trust where they're like, oh, they actually know what they're doing. Sometimes we would even know more than them because we had really studied stuff so much. Like we knew what were actually the proper procedures that they were supposed to follow. So that, particularly with law enforcement, I think can have a big impact on them being willing to talk to you. And also we just truly, not to overshare, but we just went out and we would see cops and we would be like, hello. we would start talking to them. And then we would find people, we would find them on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great place to go to find government officials, police officers, because it's not FOIA-able, because it's LinkedIn. So like you can just slide into those DMs and be like, hello, will you talk to me? And sometimes they'll ignore you and they'll just like laugh. That's the thing, you always gotta have people consent to talk to you. So just be like, give people the option if they want to or not. Sometimes we would find people on TLO and look them up and just call their cell phones and be like, hey, we know you worked on this thing, would you talk to us? And then we would ask other cops to connect us with other cops. And that was really the thing, is like if you could find one cop that will, current or former, that is like these people, like they care about the issue. Because that's the thing, is there are people who work within the Chicago Police Department that do care. And if you could connect with those people, like they will connect you to other people. And then they will talk to you because you have kind of like that in. Also, I would recommend people who are married to cops or within those communities. These are very tight-knit communities, so if you can kind of like build trust there, they'll connect you to other people because this is their social community. In Chicago, that's like one of the observations, is that they know one another. Like we do in our industry, like this is any industry, people kind of know it. So that's how we did that.
And also, like, I know for me, like, it's really frustrating to sort of figure out the precise language when you're filing these things. Like, talk to me, like, how do you, like, make sure that you're using the correct language when filing?
Okay, so one thing that's really helped us is marrying data and records. Oftentimes Trina would go and search for things in giant data sets, like very specific dates. So try to get the data on whatever you're working on, and then go and study like the policy of the actual agency, whether it's police or another thing, and see like what are their policy and procedures within the department, and then you start seeing like the words that they actually use to describe stuff. And then like go and look at reports. Try to build up sources, but just be really honest, be like, I'm new to reporting on this thing. Can I ask you like what you think this procedure would be, or what this is exactly called? Because it's like, you're trying to figure out, like map out how these like systems of information kind of move.
So I've been told to wrap up. I just have one last question. Thank you so much and Trina, I love you both, I adore you. Thank you for the work that you do. Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you to read the tea leaves a little bit, because we're seeing like this huge pushback against, accessing information. And we're seeing now we have a government in place that is making that even harder for us. How do we work this? How do we play this out? What do we do to sort of, gain them?
I'm gonna let Trina, I'm gonna say one thing and then pass to Trina. We really need each other. I think the journalism industry often operates in a deficit lens. Sometimes we don't treat each other very well. And I really think that the way that we make through this is our relationships with each other. It's collaborative projects, it's cooperation between newsrooms, it's not competitions, it's actually supporting one another, because we are really entering an age of more restrictive government, particularly around records. And based on this presentation, you can see that like government officials and government workers lie to you. They lie in public meetings, they lie in reports, they lie in their own documents. And so we really need one another, particularly, FOIA Fest is so powerful because what we're doing here is just sharing knowledge about how we do stuff. So I would say, like, my thought is that share your knowledge with other people, particularly young reporters. I gotta say, Sam Seklo has helped me so much. I literally would just DM Sam on Twitter and be like, please help me. And that's the thing, like, you can really, each of you mentor one another. Everything I really know about FOIA, like, I didn't ever have an editor who was teaching me that. I had to teach myself. And Trina and I learned a lot. I was able to learn from, the Invisible Institute folks like Andrew Fan and things. So it's like the relational aspect of this is so important, I think, in fighting this. And we really need one another. And Trina,
We do, no, I mean, speaking of like collaboration and sharing, I'm literally in Colombia right now. I just, I had a presentation yesterday, and so my travel was delayed. But I spoke for over 2 hours in Spanish, just chatting with other journalists, young journalists, people in journalism school, about how we do this and about the importance of like building those relationships with each other. You know, when at the end of the day, like as things the things hitting the fan over in DC begin to roll its way into our policies in Illinois, and it's already been happening. As that occurs, what's most important is that we have relationships with each other and the public so that we can continue to receive information, so we can continue to have insight, so that we can continue to create, and so that the public actually trusts the media and can tell us information instead of isolating. I think that's in this moment, you know, what these policies are trying to ensure is that we isolate ourselves. And what we must do as journalists is find ways to find each other, learn from each other, share. If you already did reporting on, if anyone wants to report on missing persons cases, I would happily talk to them, you know, because our work basically builds on to one another. And much of our work could not have existed without the work of other people. And so we're very thankful for all the journalists who came before us. And we're really excited for the journalists who come after us, because it is only through this relationship that we have with each other, through these relationships that we build with community, through rebuilding the trust that people have with journalists and local media, that we can continue to produce and create like impactful, important things. So thank you so much.
That was perfect. Thank you, Trina, and thank you, Sarah, so much. I'm going to toss it over to Marissa, who has a few programming notes. Thank you all.